Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Jeff Moss. He is the head of security and IT over at Encode. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Thanks for being here, Jeff. Could you give our audience some background on yourself and your career thus far?
Sure. As you mentioned, that I am the head of security and IT at Encode Technologies. My background really started not in tech. I actually kind of did a kind of a mid-career change. I was in program and project management for about a decade. And then kind of moved into the tech field and ended up as a software engineer and then kind of moved through as a product security engineer, architect, manager of product security, and then kind of like worked my way and then ended up as a CISO for a company called Rebellion Defense as a SaaS AIML startup in the defense space. And then I'm here at Encode. And Encode is it's a company that provides a biometric identity platform so that basically we use your face, your facial features, and we also use like data from documents that you might upload to identify you as an individual and basically tie your real world identity to your digital identity. So that's a very brief background of kind of my career. I've worked at 3 different unicorn startups, mostly in the security space. Tripwire is really where I started in the security space. Then Auth0, I did some work for the Air Force and helping secure their supply chain, and also Rebellion Defense, and here in Encode.
Very cool. So I'd imagine in some of those roles, leadership roles that you've held, you've done some hiring and employee development, that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, and startups, especially when they're growing at scale, right? You're moving very quickly. You have to make good decisions. Every hire counts at every step along the way. So definitely interested in talking more about the talent gap.
Very cool. So speaking of the talent gap, would you say that it's a real thing? And if so, what would you say it looks like?
You have to start with the hard questions, right? So the talent gap is tough because I think there is a talent gap. But I think it depends on the type of company you are and what stage you're at. For example, if you're just building a team, which, I've built teams from complete scratch. And when you're making that first hire or that second hire or that third hire, and you're trying to hire for a full function, there is a significant talent gap, right? You need a senior person to start that function. And that can be really, really challenging because you're also tight on budget. So finding that role and building the foundations like really early on in a company, there's a pretty significant gap. But I do believe that as you start to build out a program, become more mature, and you have more of a bench, that talent gap can be decreased. I think also security is a tough one because how do you secure something if you don't, say, know how to build it or don't have the foundations around? Let's say you're being hired as a network security engineer. You need to know networking, right? And so there is a bit of a misnomer, I think, in entry level, I think in security roles. So it really depends on the role, where the company is in their maturity, and really where the needs are for the company. And so finding those companies that have opportunities for more of those entry-level roles or roles that are kind of that take transferable skill sets, I think is really where you can address that gap.
For sure. Yeah. And I think there's people basically that fall into 2 camps on the whole entry-level thing. It's like you believe that there, in some cases, could be such thing as an entry-level security role, or like you said, you believe that you have to have a certain foundation in technology to be able to understand how to secure it. Do you think that there is such thing as a truly, entry-level security role, or can there be for certain subdisciplines of security?
I think it's possible. Yeah. Again, I think it depends on what the company needs. All right. I think that there are early analysts, like if you have a good bench in place, there's room for entry level. It may not be in very highly technical area like software engineering. I think a good example is product security. And I use product security different from application security. I look at product security as someone who can build scalable software, but also secure it. And so it's an engineer first mentality, and hiring entry level in the product security is probably not very likely. However, let's say you subscribe to the multi-tier SOC approach. There's opportunity to build that skill set in the SOC and provide entry-level opportunities there. There's also analyst opportunities when we're talking about helping build the culture, like security and business analysis. I think that those are skills that can be built early on. But they're, if it involves a depth of the technology stack in a certain way, it's going to be a hard lift, I think, for someone to be entry level. But if they have transferable skills, then, and that doesn't mean that they have to have like 10 years experience as a business analyst, but having some transferable skills around analysis and technical decision making, I think is a transferable skill that truly can be entry level if you plan the roles correctly.
Yeah, and obviously planning, I think, factors into it a lot. You can't kind of reactively hire somebody entry level. You really have to plan for that sort of thing. You have to, like you said, have the right staff in place, the right senior people to mentor that person, have a good understanding of what roles and responsibilities they're actually going to have versus just kind of hiring them and then figuring out the rest later. I think a little planning and documentation goes a long way. One of the things that's come up in previous episodes we've talked about is the importance of really having like a skills inventory or, sort of a responsibilities inventory for your team, and just kind of cataloging what each person and their job title does. And if you can figure out then if there's any parts of their job that maybe they're not a huge fan of doing, that may be something where they could share those responsibilities with the entry level person. But to your point, I think, certain disciplines maybe aren't truly, I guess, compatible with an entry-level role, whereas others are. And it would seem like you might say that once you get to a certain, I guess, size of organization, it becomes more practical to hire at that junior level.
Yeah, totally agree. And I love the concept of this kind of the skills inventory. For all the roles that I've hired, one thing that I really like to do is look at the job, build the job description. And from that job description, have basically a ladder of knowledge, skills, and abilities and impact to the company and all those types of things tied specifically to the job description. So we know exactly what we're looking for. We know what level we're looking for, and we know where there might be gaps or there might be opportunity. Say for an entry-level position. I really like that because it also takes out some potential bias in the hiring process. And then last but not least, you have your team has a very defined ladder and hey, I want to grow into this, a more senior role, or I want to move into an engineering role. And this is what I'd like to do. You actually have a path for them where they can get there. So I really like that definition. And it really kind of, I think, ensures that we're really testing for what we really need, because I think we've seen those job descriptions out there, right? Entry level, whatever. And they need 10 years experience and CISSP and all this other stuff, right? And it's just not realistic. And I'd be willing to bet that those roles were the reason why those roles exist. And I'm just making this up, but just having experienced it, is that there is pressure on budget. The role really should have been a senior role, but there wasn't budget for the role. And therefore they advertised it more as a junior role. And then, there's that disconnect there. And so I wonder if that's what's happening. Hopefully it's not unrealistic expectations from the hiring manager, but I would imagine that that's probably part of it.
Yeah, I think it could be that, or I think it's often an issue where HR doesn't really know security very well. And so they might just assemble a job description based on other job descriptions they find online and just kind of cobble it together. And maybe there's not as much oversight, perhaps, from the hiring team as there should be to make sure that that person does exist, or the requirements are realistic. How have you found, I guess, the interaction between yourself and your hiring team working with HR and recruiters? Has that been a positive relationship, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, it has been positive, but I'm very proactive with HR and our talent acquisition folks, because I think industry experience is really key in understanding what you need and what's out there in the market. Like when we start looking at, I'll just give an example. So I go back to product security versus application security. That distinction that I made doesn't exist everywhere, right? Like it exists in my mind, it exists in a lot of hiring managers' minds, but it doesn't necessarily exist in the market. So when we're looking at benchmarks, and say we were looking at Radford, we were looking at other types of tools to try to figure out, like, what do we pay? What is the market out there? How things are in terms of the market? You don't really have an apples to apples comparison. You could have somebody that is more on the assessment side. So they've been in a very large company. A lot of large companies will use kind of a more of an assessment first approach, and not like a get your hands dirty engineering type of approach, which is fine. Like, I think that it's just a different approach, but those skill sets are different, and those people get paid vastly different, but they may even have the same title, which is really challenging, because when you're having those conversations with your talent folks and your HR folks that, hey, look, I really need an engineer. And you start to look at these scales and you try to understand where people fall and how you're going to get the right talent. That can be really tough. And the security industry is not good about titles. Our titles are a mess. So it is really challenging, and kind of understanding those nuances is very important.
Yeah, you mentioned a great point that there's really no standardization across titles, and it's a trap that I think a lot of recruiting folks fall into if they don't understand the industry on a deep enough level. And I've become very well acquainted with this problem, having trained a few recruiters now, trying to help them realize, no, look, you can't really look at the job title. You have to look at what they're actually doing, what type of company they're working for, take everything, all of that context in, and kind of build a story in your mind about what this person is doing. That's a tough thing to do, especially if you don't have a lot of experience in the industry. It can be so hard, I think, for hiring teams to relay all of these intangibles and these different relationships and parallels and all of these things to a recruiter who, they don't understand the terminology. At the end of the day, it takes time to learn all of these things. And yeah, the job title thing will really throw you through a loop. And I think that's why often all these issues kind of compound. And that's why companies or hiring teams tend to default to, okay, let's just hire somebody from a similar company or a direct competitor. We know it's likely that they're going to be, experiencing this type of environment. But the challenge you encounter when doing that is you have a very narrow candidate pool in that case. And in a lot of cases where, if you're only going to hire from a direct competitor, you may only have, 5 major competitors in the market, or, 5 teams in the US you can hire from to find this person with this exact background. So I've always been a huge advocate in thinking outside the box. What is it about that person working at that company? What are the traits you're actually looking for? And can those traits exist somewhere outside of a direct competitor? And where might that person be working? Can you ever think of an example of, somebody you hired like that didn't necessarily kind of, fit the mold of what you would typically expect to hire?
Yeah, I think there's a couple examples here. So I actually, and this is probably one of the things that I'm proud about, is that we had a security champion program at Auth0. And we had some folks who were actually really security minded. They had really dove in on security. They had a training plan. They were working very hard in like moving from a more software engineer role to a product security engineer role. And they were actually able to transition. We were able to facilitate a transition to the product security team. Now, this is like an internal transition, but I've also done the same for an external candidate where we have the, basically when we talk about the job description and the needs for the job description, those knowledge, skills, and abilities, when we're looking at different levels, if you're really tight on that matrix about, hey, what's a good answer, what's not a good answer, what are we looking for, and really understanding the depth of the role, you might find some very interesting candidates on the edges. We found one that was a software engineer that had a ton of security knowledge, but had never actually held a product security role. And so, that is kind of a smaller jump necessary than to say, hire someone that doesn't have any engineering experience and try to build that software engineering skill set. So I think that was a really valuable approach. And so like those hiring managers are looking for those kind of like thinking outside of the box. Think about, like you said, where would these skill sets sit? There are some roles out there that are like security software engineer, right? Which is like a completely different thing, but also overlaps pretty significantly with product security. So you can find these talents in specific areas, but you have to know what you're looking for.
Yeah, and you have to be able to relay that to somebody who may not be as knowledgeable as you are in this area. So I kind of default to saying that, hiring teams should really default to just over communicating with their HR and their recruiters. Don't take anything for granted. Basically, just lay it all out as best as you possibly can, and spend the time on the front end to save you a little time on the back end, or a lot of time on the back end. I think, especially security folks, with budgets being what they are these days, teams running lean, there's a tendency to say, I'm just too busy, or I really can't stop to educate this recruiter right now. I have so much else to do. I'm so operationally saturated. But if you don't take the time on the front end, you're going to end up interviewing a bunch of people that aren't going to be a fit. And it could be intangibles. It might not be something that's on the resume. I think we often default to just looking at what's on the resume and expecting to see certain pieces of information there that may not always be there, even though that person could be a fit. So I always say, as a recruiter, a lot of my job is reading between the lines, looking what's not there as much as what is there, and thinking about, could I build a story around this person's career, and could I sell that, to the hiring manager? So I think, intangibles are a big thing, but how do you search for that sort of thing? Or, how do you educate your recruiters to screen for, maybe some of the soft skills you're looking for, or, motivators, that sort of thing?
That is very, very tough. I think in general, every single company I've been in is to be really effective in hiring these roles is to really understand the roles and have really good communication mechanisms between you and the HR team, the recruiting team, and other teams too that are going to be affected by the hire. So I think that's a key part. Like one of the things that we do here at Encode is we have what's called a kickoff. And it's really like a summary of the role and what success looks like for 30, 60, 90 days, and really understanding to try to get kind of a good understanding of what is this role? What do they do? What does success look like? And what does a successful candidate look like within that role? So I think that can be very helpful as well.
Yeah, and I would imagine you would want to share that with that candidate in the hiring process as well. So you're starting with the expectation setting even before they're an employee. I think that helps with retention too. If somebody gets into a role and the job is not what they expected, I hear this a lot as a recruiter. Yeah, I thought the job was going to be one thing, and then as soon as I got into it, it was not what they promised me. And so now I'm looking around again, and I've only been here 30, 60 days. But if you're able to relay what that first 30, 60, 90 days looks like, even in the interview process, there's less surprises, and your retention is going to improve. And I think anytime you get turnover, especially early on, when somebody's just come on board, that can really be a red flag to even the rest of the team. It can be a hit to morale if somebody doesn't work out in that short amount of time. Are you doing anything, I guess, or have you done anything in particular to ensure that you're getting a good sort of team and culture fit, and that you're not getting as much turnover as maybe some other teams out there?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because security, in order to have a really good fit, it's beyond just the technical skill set, right? It's also the culture. It's about how decisions are made, how decisions are made, like throughout the security team, but also within the company, and kind of the risk tolerance of the company. And there's a lot that's involved. And some people who, we'll see people who may be in a really established company for a long time, jumping into the startup world is kind of like a shock to the system, right? Like, what do you mean there's not a team for this? And what do you mean we haven't addressed that, right? And it's almost like there's a little bit of overwhelm of like, wow, like there's so much to do. And so what I do as a hiring manager is that I sell half the position, like half of the manager meeting, and then unsell it the rest of it, right? Like to really set the expectations that like, hey, I'm very transparent about the role. Here are the things that I think are going to be very rewarding, and what's really rewarding to me. And by the way, here are the challenges and like what you would face, and would that work for you? And so I think having that open dialogue about the reality of the role is really key, because like the last thing you want is someone to join expecting one thing and getting another, and then not working out because it's not a fit for them. It's not a fit for the company. It's just a lot of pain and stress for everyone. It's expensive. It doesn't work. So really being upfront and honest about what those expectations are.
That's great. I love that you spend about half and half, and that sounds about right. I think especially when you're hiring somebody super senior that has a bunch of very in-demand skill sets, the tendency is to want to really sell that person. That, or you're in the other camp where you believe that you're so amazing, everybody should want to work for you, and that's a problem too. If you're spending time adjusting expectations in the beginning and putting out the good, the bad, and the ugly about the position in the beginning, that certainly helps. And actually, it echoes something that I learned early on in my recruiting career and training. They told us to, essentially sell the candidate on the opportunity, but also take some time to quote unquote make it ugly for them. Really express to them and make clear the challenges, whether it's, a long commute or, they're going to be working long hours or whatever it may be. You really need to hit home on that to make sure that that person is comfortable with that thing. And I think ideally the right response, or a good response, would be totally understand. I understand that challenge. I've done it before in X, Y, and Z position, or I'm actually looking forward to that sort of thing, or I just kind of understand that comes with the territory in this type of role. Whereas some companies or some hiring teams might just say, well, we're only going to hire somebody from a startup environment because they're going to be most accustomed to this pace of work and wearing a bunch of different hats and all that good stuff. If you keep an open mind and you can say that, yes, we can consider somebody from a larger company, but let's ask them these tough questions in the interview process. You're getting the best of both worlds, where you're opening up your candidate pool and you're not, restricting it unnecessarily, but then you're also expectation setting and making sure you have a good fit for the long term. So that's a great approach. Anything else that you're doing from, I guess, a retention standpoint, I guess, moving past sort of the short term into the medium to long term? What do you do to keep people, happy and engaged?
Well, what I try to do is to have an appropriately sized team from the beginning. I mean, that's like the number one goal is, look, burnout is real. I've been there. I think almost anybody in security has been there, right? Where it really has an effect. And I think there is this kind of like this, for security, there's this guardian kind of mantra, right? Like where, hey, no one else is doing it, so we got to do it, right? And so we take on a lot of responsibility, even maybe if it's more than really it should be, right? Like maybe there's something that should be more weighed as a business decision rather than like a security decision, depending on the thing. But burnout's real. So ensuring that you have the right size team so that you're not overworking constantly is, I think, really important. And, the reality is budgets are what they are, right? So we kind of have to work with that. And so sometimes that means spreading the love with other teams and bartering and having cross-functional relationships to help out, but really making sure that the amount of work that's being actually produced, right, and that is necessary is congruent with an individual in like a normal work environment. And if you can't do that, then you need to figure out as a manager, how am I going to sustain this and make sure that I'm not burning my people out? Because if we burn those people out, I mean, your everything's going to suffer, and it's just really impactful on people's lives. So I would say that's the number one thing. Now, budget constraints aside, right? Like the next thing is really identifying training opportunities. I think if you're not training in security, you're already behind. So when building a budget for a team, build in that training every year, build it into the budget from the beginning. It's really, really important. And you'll find that you have better morale. People stick around. They see where their career is going. They're on a path. And there are ways to be creative too with budget around that. I would say, and then the last thing I think that is not probably discussed enough is making sure that you have a diverse team. I think that really contributes to a better team culture. If everybody is kind of thinking the same way, looks the same, does things the same, you kind of lose that creativity. And it's also kind of, really the right thing to do to really make sure that the security industry is representative of the people who want to enter it and be in it. So I think that that's also an area that we're for retention, because if you have a diverse team and you celebrate that diversity, and diversity is, a lot of different things as well, then you also attract that kind of talent as well.
Speaking of which, you mentioned attracting good talent. I know sometimes for startups that can be especially challenging because you don't necessarily have the brand name or recognition or employer brand or anything like that to rely on. And that's, I guess, a fun challenge for me personally as a recruiter, having worked for and with a lot of startups over the years. I enjoy being able to tell the story of a startup and really get people excited about something that they haven't heard of before. What have you been able to do as far as, working for startups and building teams for startups to attract, really good people?
Well, I think the first part is it's just a different mentality. I think, personally, I've been one of those people who have been in a few different roles and specialized roles. And one thing that I learned about myself is that I really enjoy being a generalist. I really enjoy building things from the ground up and like owning my own mistakes and owning my own problems that I create, right? Rather than inheriting other people's problems and mistakes that they create. So it's a different mentality. It's this builder versus kind of operational mentality. And I think, as there's opportunity in a startup for both. At first, you need to build the function and then you need to operate it. And if you're really scaling up, say you're one of the $1 billion companies that's scaling pretty significantly, you then need to put on your operational hat and say, I built this function. Now I need to make sure that we're operating in the most efficient way and preparing for scale. And those two challenges are making kind of a multifaceted role. And if you ever feel like you've been in a role where you're like, man, I'm pigeonholed. I'm pigeonholed in this one specialty. And I just feel like I'm not having an impact. I mean, that's I think where people really shine in startups is that they want to make an impact, and you will from day one, because there's so much to do. And, being a builder is a part of that. So of course there's that. And I think that's more intrinsic motivation. Then of course, as a startup, you've got to have skin in the game. That is stock options it's that upside opportunity, right? Like not every startup's going to make it. But the upside potential is pretty significant when they really knock it out of the park. So I think that's also a big part of it, right? So I think those two pieces are being a part of something bigger and then having that upside. I think that can be very attractive, but it's not for everybody. I've had many interviews with people that when we talk about, I start unselling the position, I'm like, well, maybe not, right? Like not everybody is prepared to take on that kind of risk. Like startups are just naturally risky, but with risk, there's reward. So I think, it's being in that mentality and really understanding that, like, where are those people? Are they thriving for something where they can have a big impact? And if they are, normally that's a really good fit.
It's interesting. You mentioned risk and how startups are usually viewed as risky. I would argue that in the last couple of years, almost any company seems risky.
Yeah, that's true, right? This market,
this economy. I mean, you see the big tech companies laying a bunch of people off, and large banks, and everybody that you would think traditionally would be a relatively stable company. That's why I always tell people, like, look, go either where the money is or go where it sounds interesting. And don't worry so much about the other stuff. Like, yes, I know, you have a family to feed, but try and follow the interesting work. Always be building your resume. Always kind of have irons in the fire and be planning for the future and building your network and stuff like that. And I think we have an issue in the modern day where there's not as much investment from the companies and the employees and from the employees in the companies. So I think retention becomes a problem these days when people don't feel that there's any loyalty from the employer side. Is there anything that you've done specifically to engender, I guess, a sense of loyalty in the folks that report to you, or to try and build that company loyalty when it seems to be not so common anymore?
So one of the things is introspection as a manager. People tend to leave their jobs because of their manager, and that's like the number one thing. So be a good manager. And that means there's a lot involved in that. I think that could be like a whole separate podcast series, right? But really try to be introspective about how you are as a manager and how you're perceived. I think the other part too is, don't expect loyalty. Loyalty is not something that's just given out. It's something that's people stick around because they trust in that, right? They built that trust with the company and you as a manager. But I think it's a really important topic, right? Because it's the expectation of loyalty. I think, maybe the prior generations, there was this like, hey, I'm going to be in a job for 30 years. I'm going to get the golden watch, like the end of my retirement. It just doesn't exist we're getting closer and closer to like more gig economy kind of work. There's just, I think people are realizing that right, like, I don't think grass is always greener on the other side, but I also think that people will have what's important to them, and they should really weigh that out. And if working at a company and a specific company is not for you because your personal values are all those mixed pieces, then like it sucks, because right, like there's really not anything that you can do to retain that because the gap is too wide. But if it's little things, and if it's things that like that you can work through, like if someone's really bored because they're just doing all the same stuff, right? And it's like, man, I just don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. You should know that as a manager. You should be talking to your folks and be like, I can see that you're bored because this is like all repetitive work. Let's figure out how we're going to automate this. How are we going to take it to the next level? Like give people the opportunity to grow and shine and like solve those problems on their own. I think no one really likes their manager to come in and say, well, here's the solution to the problem, right? Like, engineers don't like that at all. So, and I was one, so I can attest to that. So I think really considering your options and being open-minded about like, how can I be creative to align the wants and needs of this individual and their career with that of the company. And if you can find that alignment, then I think you'll have better retention.
For sure.
If you can't, then like you probably won't have great retention.
Yeah, and if you can, you would start talking about all these motivators and things, what drives somebody, what gets them out of bed in the morning early on in the recruiting process. So again, It's kind of like expectation setting. They're telling you kind of what they expect and what they're going for, and you're trying to match that with whatever you have at the company. And if it doesn't match, no worries, no harm, no foul. At the end of the day, you try and make a match for as long a period of time as you can, but you can't always know that it's going to work out in the long term. And two, I mean, there's so many changes that happen that come down from the higher ups that sometimes people feel like they can't change, and there's not always a fix to that sort of thing. Sometimes it just is what it is, and it's time for that person to move on. And but I think sometimes hiring managers, they have this sense that people owe them tenure or loyalty or something like that. It seems to be relatively common. Not saying everybody's that way. And so when somebody leaves, it's almost like a personal affront, or they almost feel insulted. But you'd mentioned that you almost have to just assume that people are going to leave. I mean, it's a fact of life, like we were talking about. There's not necessarily as much loyalty in either direction anymore. What do you do, I guess, as a hiring manager to plan for that inevitable attrition that you're always going to get some of? How do you ensure that your team stays up and running and cohesive in the event of somebody's departure like that?
That is so hard, because planning for attrition is like, you really don't know. And you can say, well, I think this person may not be the happiest, and I have a path for them to like address that and see what other things we can do. But my experience is that like when it comes to attrition, you may think that like person A is a high risk of leaving, and then all of a sudden person B leaves, right? And person A never had the intent to like actually leave, and or maybe that's just it's anecdotal. I don't have really like evidence here, but that's just my experience, is that it's just very hard to know if someone is planning their next move, and it's having those conversations early is really important, and really having an understanding of where people are at. But at the same time, if someone is really looking to leave, they may not give you that indication, right? Like they're going to be protecting their career. They don't want to be in the spot where it's like, oh, could be a potential attrition risk, and like create more problems for themselves. So I think building the trust with your team. I've had people have left for better careers, and I didn't have the opportunity to to promote them into a position. We just didn't have that path for them. And they found a path outside the company. And it was really hard. It was really hard to see them leave because they were fantastic people. But at the same time, it was a bit of a compliment, I think, because this person had grown. They'd grown out of the role and into a bigger role. And we still keep in contact, like I keep in contact with these folks who've moved on. I think that's another thing too, is just because it doesn't work right now doesn't mean it won't work in the future. I've interviewed a number of candidates that were just not really a great fit at the time. And I saw a role, like a colleague and posted a role, and it was I was like, holy cow, you need to talk to this person. So I reached out to that prior candidate and said, hey, do you mind if I do an intro? And, we've had some really great connections there. So I think, particularly in this market, it can be really discouraging. I mean, it's, you apply to a bunch of different jobs and you think that you're a perfect fit for a job, and then you get rejected or you don't make it through the process. Really consider that it's a longer game, right? About connections and understanding, like, sometimes it's just timing. It may look like it's a perfect fit, job description, everything, but the hiring manager may be looking for a specific skill set to solve a specific need that's not really clear, right, in that job description. So I would just say, like, for this market, that's a big thing to not be too hard on yourself. Understand where you might have those gaps if you can get that information. But just because it's not a fit now does not mean it's not a fit in the future or that it has any kind of bearing on you as an individual.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about those referrals and those relationships and how crucial they can be to somebody's career in the long term. I think often, I know I'm kind of this way. I tend to get distracted by, what's in front of my face. If I'm going to look for a job, I need a job right now. And, that's what I'm going to focus on. Same thing when it comes to hiring. Once you have an open seat, you really have to focus on that. But if you were able to plan more leading up to that situation, if you had kept up your networking and kept your industry contacts fresh. I've spoken to a number of CISOs over the last couple of months that are all looking for jobs right now. And whether it was, the company's going under, they're a risky startup and the economy started to flounder a little bit. And so everything went south, or, they're not able to get any budget or headcount when they really need to grow the security team to be effective. All these sorts of things. A lot of them will often say, look, I didn't keep up with my network as perhaps I would have liked to. And then same thing on the hiring side. If you're constantly talking to people who could be for a fit for your team in the long term, it's much more easy to make that hire if and when you do get that position versus kind of always reacting to what's in front of your face, which I think is kind of the default. Are there any, you'd mentioned kind of the state of the market right now, how that can be challenging for candidates. What about the hiring side? Any particular challenges that you've encountered over the years when hiring good people?
Well, our conversation 2 years ago would be very different than it is today, right? Like 2 years ago, it was, you really had to work to find talent. Top talent is still very hard to find. But like in this market, if you can't hire your roles, I would say like really take a second look at, right? Am I limiting my geographic area to an area that maybe this like a kind of a talent desert? You know what I mean? Or, is the role, if you can make the role remote, and that's possible, that can be a huge benefit. How's your pay? And like, what can you afford? And how competitive is it with the market today? Because, even though the market is really like an employer's market, it's, I think that talent does know what they're worth, right? And so it can be, if you end up really undercutting the budget, like what are you going to do to yourself for a year from now? And I forget what the number is, but somewhere around 3 million unfilled, cyber jobs.
That's what they said. Yeah.
Well, I mean, who knows if that's the reality, but I believe it, because I think there are like a lot of my colleagues out there, myself included, that where an ideal team or a solid performing team requires a certain like hiring level, and a lot of times you're asked to make do with less, and particularly in this market. So what does that mean when, right, like there is pretty significant growth? That means that as you grow into kind of the next step or maturity level or market, then you've got to do even more work to get there rather than like do it up front. And I think that's a strategy that's determined by the company, right? Like, when do we spend and when do we grow and when do we start putting resources to the right places? And so you're going to have some catch up to do. And so you don't want to be doing that and having people going, well, market's pretty good, right? Like, I'm going to start looking around and see if I can, get a 30% pay bump. That's significant. That's really hard to compete against. So that would be my advice, is that like, try to, as best you can. I understand the budgetary constraints, and I totally get it. And you have what you have, but at the same time, really planning out, forecasting out, and saying, okay, if we're going to hire in this market at a lower rate, we really need to understand, where is this market going, and how do we make sure that we're continually reevaluating how the market changes, because the market changes really significantly. I mean, 2 years ago versus today, I mean, it feels like a decade difference, right? I've never seen anything like it. So I don't know, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, it moves so fast. I think a good example of that would be like DFIR consultants. I'm trying to think back timeline wise. It was maybe about year and a half ago, where there was a dip in ransomware. And so all the DFIR consulting firms laid people off. And there was this glut of candidates on the market. And then all of a sudden it turned around. And then all of a sudden now the DFIR firms are hiring again. And so the people that were all laid off 6 months ago are now being so in demand again. And again, salaries are ticking way up, just simple supply and demand fluctuations. So yeah, it's pretty common. It's a hard time. It's a hard deal to get your arms around that if you're not like actively talking to these candidates all the time. That's why I always encourage hiring managers, talk to a recruiter in your niche. They're going to give you live salary data that you may not be able to get at any location online, at least reliably. And, going back to the job title discussion, there's no standardization across job titles. So, you could go on Glassdoor or salary.com or whatever, and you look at security analyst salary, and it's like, 110K. It's like, well, if you're talking about a SOC analyst, security analyst, tier 1, it's more like 60, So how do you evaluate those salaries out there? And it helps to talk to somebody who's really on the front lines, but I would say. Well, we're coming up on time, Jeff. So just one last question for you. Is there anything that we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
I think we touched on it, but really prioritizing mental health in this industry is, like you have a tight job market, it's a stressful industry, right? And so really making sure that you have that, I won't say balance, but you have a plan and approach to handle all that's just kind of thrown at you, in particular this industry, because not only is the market really tight, and a lot of people are looking for jobs, and that can be really impactful to individuals, but also like those teams that are missing those coworkers that have been laid off, that are like working those extra hours and more like taking on other people's jobs as well to keep the lights on. So really, as a hiring manager, thinking about how am I going to address these issues in a holistic way, and the answer isn't always hiring, because you may not have the budget. So you're going to have to figure out what things to drop, what things are kind of risks that you can take on and just really work through that. And then also, for those that are looking for jobs, please, don't take it personally, keep working at it, work with folks like you, right? To really get an understanding of where you stand and work through it.
Absolutely. And shout out to Dr. Tammy Hollis. She actually did her PhD thesis on burnout in security, specifically DFIR. She's a great person to talk to if you're curious about that topic, and you can find her on LinkedIn. Speaking of which, Jeff, if people want to reach out to you or follow what you do, what's the best way to do so?
I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, so feel free to send me a LinkedIn and let me know that you'd like to chat.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for your time, Jeff, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Talent Gap Fireside Chat. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Hit that notification bell to be notified when we drop a new episode. New episodes air every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.